Good morning. Welcome to the First Congregational Church, where everyone's someone and Jesus is Lord. You know, it's awkward, I guess. 2 weeks ago, I stood on this stage and I said, I hate Facebook churches. And yet here we are, 2 weeks later, being a Facebook, or at least an online church. Some of you ask me, why is it that I hate Facebook churches? Well, it's because I don't think that the Facebook church can really do the things that a church is called to do. Church, the word in Greek simply means a people called together for a purpose. And those purposes are to worship God together, to love each other, and to make disciples of all nations. I think it's very difficult to do that online. And yet, here we are. You know, we have to remember that the reason that I was saying I hate Facebook churches is because I was confessing to you that I am resistant to change. Most religious people, as a matter of fact, are resistant to change when it comes to the things of God. It's very normal. Remember, when Jesus was on earth, the Pharisees hated him so much because they were resistant to change what they believed was their relationship to God. In the early church, we talked about in Acts just a couple of weeks ago, that the earliest Christians were Jewish and they were unhappy that God was going to begin to accept the Gentiles on equal basis with them. They were resistant to changing the way God was going to do things. And too often we are also resistant to change. I wonder if God laughed at me 2 weeks ago when I stood up and said that I hated the Facebook church, since he knew what was going to be happening. Now, what can we do though? How can we be the church in our Facebook era today? Well, one of the things that churches do and do well is to encourage one another, to comfort each other when things are going wrong, and that's something that we can definitely do together as a church, even if we are only meeting online. Around the world today, and in our church as well, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety. There are people who are afraid of what's going on because of the virus, because of the economic situation that goes with that. And so we ought to be comforters, people who can help others to get through that fear, that anguish that they may be feeling because of what's happening today. So how do we do that? What is it that what is it that we ought to be doing? How can we do that? And the way it is remember that God is in control. That's really the basis for the peace that we have, is that God is in control of all these things. Let me give you a quick example from the scriptures. This is a letter to the Philippians. It was written by the Apostle Paul, and at the time he wrote it, he was in prison. And the letter to the Philippians is actually a thank you note. They had sent him some supplies for him while he was in prison, and they expressed their great concern for him. And of course, you would be concerned as well. If someone that you loved was in a prison, you didn't know their condition, they could be killed at any time. And so they wanted to know, Paul, are you okay? Is everything well? We're concerned about you. So in the letter, he writes and he says, deal with anxiety this way. I'm reading in chapter 4, starting with verse 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let all men know your forbearance. The Lord is at hand. Have no anxiety about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will keep your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. That's really the key to living relatively anxiety-free, is to keep our eyes on Jesus. Paul writes, the Lord is at hand. We have a great faith and a great trust that God is with us wherever we go, and that we can look to him and find the peace that we need. Rejoice, the Lord is at hand. Well, some people might say, well, wait a minute, bad things still happen. I mean, we can still be worried about bad things happening. And of course, that's true. Bad things do happen. They happen to good people. They happen to Christian people. They happen to faithful people. So where does that peace come from? Well, it comes from another verse. Perhaps you've seen it on the internet this week as it's been plastered all over the place. And that's Romans 8:28, which says, we know that in everything God works for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Now, to be honest with you, that's been misquoted quite a bit on the internet this week. But the promise is there that God is working everything for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Again, it doesn't mean everything is good. It means that God is working and is able to change these things to good for his people and for his glory. Think about it. A couple of weeks ago, again, we were in the book of Acts, and we were talking about the great persecution that started after the stoning of Stephen. People were being dragged out of their homes, stoned to death, imprisoned. Obviously not a good thing. And yet God used that to send his disciples out throughout the region to share the gospel of the grace of God. He took a very bad situation, still bad, but he used it for good for his people and for his glory, and frankly for you and I today, because if that didn't happen, perhaps we don't know and we don't walk in the grace of God the way that we do now. It's been that way throughout history. Throughout times of trial in history, Christians have stood up and said, we're going to follow Christ, we're going to serve our communities in grace and love, and God is glorified, and people come to him. There was an emperor in the 2nd century, and he wanted to know, who are these Christians and what are they up to? So he sent a spy out there, and the spy came back and said, these Christians are incredible people. They love with all their hearts. They welcome strangers. They share what they have in the worst of circumstances. Something is different about these people. These Christians are loving people. I don't know whether that spy became a Christian, but I do know that it was the caring for one another in times of deep difficulty that brought the message of Christ to the Roman emperor at that time. And it's been the same way throughout history. Later, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, it was Christians who stayed in the cities. They didn't flee, they stayed and they served the people who were left there, again, for the glory of God. It was a wonderful testimony to what God could do in their lives. And what about today? I mean, is God going to use the coronavirus, the pandemic that we have, is he going to use it for our good and for his glory? Well, he has promised to do that. And he is all powerful, he's all knowing, he's all good. So yes, I think we can depend on him to do that, to work for good in all things for those who love him and are ordained according to his purpose. Now, you have to notice there's a catch line on the back of that. You can't say that God is working good for everybody. You can't say everything that God does is good, but you can't say that everything that happens in the world is good. It says that God works good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So I guess if we really want to have confidence, if we really want to have the peace that passes all understanding that Paul wrote about, we need to ask ourselves, do we love God? Are we true followers of his? How do we know whether or not we love God? Well, Jesus, through the Apostle John, said, you are my followers. I'll know that you love me if you do my commands. So the question is, are we doing what God has commanded, what Jesus has commanded? And of course, there are three things. We're called to worship God, to love God with all our heart and all our mind and all our strength. We're called to love our neighbor as ourselves, and we're called to make disciples of all nations. If we're doing those things, then we are loving God. We are called according to his purposes. So, will God use this for good today? Yes. Yes, he will. I don't know how, but I can imagine some things. For instance, we are now quarantined to a certain extent. Schools are shut down, businesses are shut down. There's not a lot going on. In the past, we've been running all over the place, trying to catch our tails, taking the kids to their soccer games and garden clubs and chamber meetings and whatever it might be. Those are all done. What are we doing with that extra time? Are we frittering away watching Seinfeld reruns? Are we, well, you fill in the blank. What could we be doing with that time? Well, we could be growing closer to God. Remember, part of the point of the church is to worship God. So we could be worshiping. We could be spending time in our Bibles. We could be spending time in prayer. We could worship God. We could our relationship could become better and closer to the Christians that he's calling us to be. You know, perhaps, and I don't know this, but perhaps as the church around the world is sequestered and alone and calmed a little bit from the frenzy of life, maybe a new generation of fully dedicated and mature Christians will grow out of this and fill the world when it opens again with people who are open to him and his movement in their lives. I would certainly pray for that. Another thing that the church is called to do is to serve our communities. Now, we maybe can't do that physically, especially those of us who are at risk, but we can certainly pick up the phone and make a phone call. We can send a letter, type an email. There's many ways that we can serve and we can share God's love with others. And maybe that sharing of God's love includes letting them know how they can enjoy the peace. Maybe it has to do with comforting your next door neighbor, on the phone, of course, to help them to overcome and to learn about the peace that passes all understanding. There's many ways that we can serve and to share his love with our neighbors and with each other, even though we can't do it face to face. But here's the takeaway. The takeaway is, as Paul wrote in Philippians, the Lord is at hand. We just need to look for him. We need to look for him and trust him and experience the joy and the peace that Paul has promised us in Philippians. We could share that with our neighbors and help them to enjoy it too. Usually, at this time during the service, we would be having an offering. We'd be passing the plate and praying and thanking God for what he's done in our lives. But let me just challenge you as we pass the plate figuratively. Why don't you take a moment and pray and ask God if there's some way that you could grow closer to him, if there's some way that you could serve him, if there's something that you've been holding back and keeping from being the person that God has called you to be. Why don't you just put it in our plate and spend some time thanking him and feeling and knowing that joy and that peace that passes all understanding. Take some time to meditate.